Good day, fellow champions of inclusion. I am A. Ron, and this is the Inclusive Dad Podcast, where we explore inclusion and make it practical. Before we dive in, don't forget to subscribe, rate, or review the show on your favorite platform. We truly appreciate your feedback and would be honored if you shared the podcast with friends and family who might benefit. If you want to support us in our mission, please click on the link in the show description. Today, my guest is Ashantis Jones. Welcome to the show.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Why don't we start off when you just tell me a little bit about yourself?
Sure. So my name is Ashantis. I use both she and they pronouns equally. And I am a wellness educator. I do that through a couple of different facets. I have my master's of education in counseling, where I specialize in college counseling, student affairs, and clinical mental health. And then I also have been working within the fitness industry. I started in 2012 and have worked for a couple of big boutique fitness studios, as well as running my own business where I see one-on-one clients for personal training or for group fitness. And then also truly on the education part, going and speaking in areas like this in the podcast world, but then also out in the IRL conference world, speaking about the different facets of mental health and physical health and how we can look at those things a bit more holistically. And my experience really stemmed from being able to grow my knowledge and education around eating disorder recovery, and things just kind of branched out wider and wider and wider from there. So I'm really excited to be here with y'all today.
Thank you so much. My next question I ask is, what is your definition of inclusion? So I'll read what you submitted and then you can expand on that. So what you submitted is intersectionality is the key to our liberation.
Yeah. So as a clinical therapist, you'll hear people say they use cognitive behavioral therapy as their approach. They use a person-centered approach. And as I was going through my master's program, trying to figure out what different approaches I wanted to be able to pull from in the actual therapeutic space, one of the things that I came across was intersectionality. And while that is not a specific theory within the mental health field, it is a way to really think about how we look at health in a more holistic manner. And so that intersectionality piece, all that really means for folks that aren't aware is that I am looking at a person and I'm looking at the full self and the intersection of all the different identities they have, because something that we've learned from a sociology standpoint is that when people are Black and a woman and queer and disabled, right? All of those intersections of these multiple marginalized groups comes together in this person's identity and really shapes the way in which they see the world through those various lenses, but understanding that they can't just see the world as a Black person or just as a queer person or just as a disabled person, that they have to see it through all of those lenses at the same time. And I think as a society and as a globe, if we took the time to be able to see people in their variety of intersections and understand where folks are coming from, we would be able to do so much wonderful good in the world.
Yeah, that's great. That's very interesting. I also was reading a book and I can't think of the name, but where it kind of talked about that, where we are like pieces of all those different things that you discussed.
Yeah.
I'm not just the one identity. So do you find like that's something new to people where we don't really think in terms of all the pieces like that? Because I guess just for me, I don't think that way. So that's something that we just aren't taught. Do you think?
I think so. I think that we are taught about, these different facets of marginalization and are aware that they exist, right? Like at some point in our lives, very young, right? We know the difference between somebody being upper class, middle class, lower class from a financial standpoint, right? We may understand the differences between the fact that we're going to school in an environment with families that may have Catholic religious values, that may have Muslim religious values, that may have Sikh religious values, right? They all are coming from these different areas. We're probably also aware, or possibly in a population where we're seeing people that have a bunch of different skin tones and skin shades and come from a bunch of different ancestry, right? But to your point, you're correct. We are not layering and looking at all of those things together usually. We're most often looking at them as all very separate things. But I think in a historical standpoint, a really good example of this is Black women during the women's, to some degree, they had to make a decision. Do I want to stand with women and fight with women against the patriarchy? Or do I want to stand with the other Black men who may possibly be hurting us from a patriarchal standpoint, but we have that shared bond of both being Black and not having rights that we should have simply for the color of our skin. So I think that's like one of the really, big pivotal pieces. And then like on top of that, queer Black women too, because obviously around that time we're also starting to see Stonewall riots. So it really of their identity, when the reality is, how can you just pick one piece of who you are? All of those things make you who you are.
Yeah, that's great. So has this kind of always been how you thought about inclusion in this stuff, or how did you get to this? How did you get to this spot?
Definitely not.
Okay.
I would say that while I feel like I grew up in a fairly progressive household, that we spoke about these things. We spoke about racism and sexism because they were things that, I was obviously experiencing. And so my parents had to be able to explain the framework so I could understand what I was experiencing in the world for the first time. But I don't think it was really until I got into my master's program and had to really start thinking about how we understand each other from that theoretical framework, that it really started to put those pieces together for me. And I think that honestly, being a person that spent so much of my time focused on the different ways in order to support eating disorder recovery, this was something that came up a lot of times. Because so often when we think about eating disorders, we think of usually folks that are very, very thin or undernourished, if you will. And then usually women, and then usually white. But the reality is eating disorders do not care. They get everybody, right? And so I think being able to deconstruct some of the narratives in that space and then reconstruct them in order to support my future clients is what really put me on this path to be able to understand the beauty of intersectionality and to be able to learn from activists that have come before me and how I can really do my part to put some of that social justice back into the therapeutic space so that people are not always internalizing everything as their fault when a lot of it isn't theirs. It's really that of the system in which we live in, and being able to acknowledge that can really help folks create behavior change if there is behavior change to create. And again, to just like not internalize things so much, because it truly is not on them that somebody is being sexist to them. It's not their fault. It could be truly anybody in the world. And so how do we decouple individuals' value from a system that we live in?
Yeah, that's great. So have you always been included?
Ooh, also no, definitely not. I think that now in this point of my life, my ability to discern the reasons in which people want to be around me has increased. And also my own discernment of who I want to be around me as well. I think there was this point in my life where I wanted to be included so badly that I was willing to not be my truest self and to fit into somebody else's boxed or, just different version of me that wasn't as authentic. And that now I'm in a space in my life, I think truly because of work that I do with clients, where I feel like I have to really live the values that we're also learning about in the clinical and non-clinical space. Because the reality is, with inclusion, I think that there is this false narrative of we just want everybody to be included. So just like get everybody in the same room, if you will. But the reality is it comes down to more than that. It comes down to shared values. And if we don't have shared values, then we probably don't actually have inclusion, but rather just the symbolism of it. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great point. For sure. Yeah, the
Yeah.
include yeah, the shared value piece and like living your true self. I mean, I'm let's see, 47, and I'm just in the last couple of years starting to live like more
Mhm.
my true self, because like you're saying, just trying to fit into certain spots that, I mean, I grew up Baptist, a lot of religious stuff
Mhm.
growing up, and a lot of those things have stuck with me way longer than I realized. So just, things that I was taught repeatedly when I was younger, I'm trying to get some of that stuff worked through, and then just, being myself, and the people that are supposed to be around me will be around me, and that kind of thing. So just I'm starting to get closer to that. So that's very important to be able to do that. So that's
Yeah.
awesome that you're realize that and are
Yeah.
working towards that for sure.
Thank you. I feel very blessed to be able to have found really a lot of chosen family
Yep.
in the last 10 or so years, and that we all have kind of gone through these journeys in a parallel. And so we're all growing as individuals, but our individual growth is also supporting our friendship and our collective growth. And that I think is what really allows me to like continue to sit into this, is because I know that I have a community that truly supports me within that, and that wants me to be my most authentic self in the same way that I want them to be their most authentic selves.
Yeah, that's very key there. Like you talked about a community where, yeah, they are supporting you, you can support them. That makes a huge difference also.
Yeah, very much so. Very much so.
So growing up in school, were you in special education or gen ed, or where were you?
I was in gen ed. I was
Okay.
in the gifted
Okay.
program for most of my education. I started in Montessori and then went to a Catholic school and then went to public school. Spent a little stint in charter. So I think, being able to grow in all of these different types of educational environments. And my mom is an educator, so being able
Okay.
to see her, speak about these things not only from like a classroom standpoint, but more so from a administration and like policy and procedure standpoint. Growing up, I think that I knew I was different. I knew that I was different, but it wasn't really until the last 5 years that like I finally received my diagnoses and understood why I was different. I
Sure.
knew that there was something, but there, unfortunately, at the time, because I was not in a place where I was, I didn't have compulsive or erratic behaviors as a child. No one assumed I had autism or ADHD, because they're like, well,
Okay.
she like sits in the corner, so she's fine. She's not, terrorizing anybody. And I'm like, that's not the only form that shows in kids. But
Right.
all the research at that time surrounding autism and ADHD were done on young white males, not on young Black females. So
Okay.
there was no even thought. It was just like, she's just a little quirky. She forgets things a lot. She could do a lot, but also she can at the same time. It like we just didn't have the language for it, because our perception at that time was completely different from where it is now. Yeah.
That's interesting. So do you know, is there, I haven't looked at the numbers about this, so do you know, is there like like percentages of kids or numbers of kids that are white that are diagnosed with autism
Mm,
versus African American? Is there like a huge disparity
yeah.
there?
I mean, in general, I would say within the mental health field, there is unfortunately a disparity that exists within who has access to even attempt to be diagnosed in any capacity.
Sure.
But two, also, when you have to look at, when you're looking at Western mental health and the history of it, the reality is that they weren't including anybody usually outside of white people in the research that was being done around all of these different disorders. And so we know that that was happening, unfortunately, due to racism for the most part, right? It was like, why would we study non-white people when at that time they did not see non-white people equally as people? Right. So unfortunately, it's like we're really dealing with the ramifications of the ways in which something like racism is like unfortunately embedded within our medical history, whether that be from a physical or mental health standpoint. So oftentimes what you would perceive to be just a young Black boy being bad could be the same exact behavior as a young white boy, but because people see a young Black boy as a man, unfortunately, and they see a young white boy as a child, that impacts that diagnosis. And so now, instead of looking at autism, we're maybe saying that they have some type of just like anger or aggressiveness that is inherently there because of genetics. But like we know biologically that race is not it is not scientific. It is more of a social construct. And so with that in mind, we have to kind of go back and say, okay, well, if at some point doctors were literally being taught that the darker somebody's skin was, the more their pain tolerance was, even though there was nothing to support that, of course, 40, 50 years down the line, that's how we get to this point. So no, I don't have like specific numbers off the top of my head, but in general, there is definitely continues to be a big gap. And unfortunately, due to things like unconscious bias, right? This isn't all just like overtly people being biased. Some of it is unconscious as well. The odds are that they're going to look at something else simply because of the color of the person's skin. And I would love to say that, the system of therapy and clinical mental health, that we are far surpassed that at this time. But unfortunately, we are not. There's, not a lot of clinicians who look like me. I'm struggling to find a therapist because I know most of the Black women therapists in my state because there's so few of us. So like, how do I even find somebody who does the work that I do, but I can't know them already? And, so it definitely becomes a little bit tricky. Just because there's not a ton of folks that are in the space that are asking these questions, because they aren't questions that they would think to ask because they do not live within the intersections of the identities. So you just don't know what you don't know.
For sure. Yeah, you talked about a lot of great stuff there, but part the inclusion piece, or just, having people that look different than you or are different than you, in the different professions, that's a huge, like you're saying, a huge thing, because just you having a different perspective about the mental health field and being in it just opens up, you can help other people see things that they don't see, or bring up questions, which is a huge thing also. And you also talked about how race has kind of been stuff's embedded into our society, and I've done some reading about like disability pieces, and there's a lot of stuff that's happens still today with people with disabilities that has been around for, it's done hundreds of years ago this way, and there's still remnants of, like you're talking with race, there's similar things with disability, and also which connects with race, some of it that's happens now because of stuff that's been around forever, and we need to talk about it and figure out why this is happening this way, because it's, this happened hundreds of years ago. We need to change something. So that's very important.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think like when we speak about disability, 30% of the American population is disabled, but there most people do not want to wear the identity of being disabled, I think because they understand how ableist our society is.
Yeah.
And so, again, from that intersectionality perspective, you have somebody who's disabled and they're already like going through all of the things that come along with living in the society being disabled.
Right.
And then you add them being possibly queer on top of that. What the heck are they supposed to do?
Right.
Like, where do you go? Where are the resources to support both of those beings and both of those identities, which are, so crucial to somebody's self?
And big part of my story is I'm from southern Minnesota. I don't recall ever seeing anybody with a disability in a wheelchair, anything growing up. I grew up in a super small town, and the only time I saw somebody that didn't have white skin was when we lived around vegetable farms. So at the time when I was young, there'd still be like migrant workers. So Hispanics that would travel up from down South Texas area to work in the field. So that would be the only time I would see non white people. So I grew up very not racially diverse, not any of that stuff. So as I've gotten older, I worked. Now there's way more non-white people around in the town where I live. So that happened, and then I worked in a mental health inpatient facility for children for a few years. So I wasn't around anybody, queer or transgender, any of that, that it didn't identify, have the different identities. So I was around that at that point. So I'm getting into more of the racially diverse, more different things like that as I've gotten older. So having to learn it. So just a huge part of it is about being around people that are different than you, or if somebody looks different, get to know them, ask questions. Because like you said before, I think if you don't know what you don't know, if you're not around somebody that doesn't look differently than you, you're not gonna, learn about them or anything like that. So you're very nice. It's fun talking to you because you have a different perspective than me, obviously. I grew up in vastly different situations, so it's nice hearing from you as well.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And I think that these types of conversations really are what brings us towards being able to have like collective liberation at the end of the day. Because if I can't understand who you are and where you come from and what made you who you are, and you can't understand that about me, then like, are we really gonna want to like kumbaya and work together to fight towards something? Probably not. It'll be like, you're a stranger, I'm a stranger, stranger danger. So I think that these types of conversations are so important. And kudos to you for creating this space for folks that are ready to learn and want to learn. And sometimes, again, when you don't know what you don't know, you're like, what do I even have to learn? Or I don't need to learn that because I've gotten through life without it. But the reality is that I feel so much more present as an individual in this world because I am looking at my own perspectives, but I am also constantly seeking the perspectives of others and learning from their own lived experience and partnering that with what we do know from a clinical mental health standpoint and from a physical fitness standpoint, all these other facets in which I work. But it's really important to just chat with each other.
Yeah, for sure. So I've given two TEDx talks on inclusion. My most recent one, I talked more about how we can use empathy to be more inclusive. How do you think we can use empathy to be more inclusive?
Oh my goodness. I mean, I think empathy is a huge emotional skill. It's something that people oftentimes do have to learn, or have at least learn the ability to maybe like grow, shrink, depending on the situation. But I think empathy at the end of the day is really just saying that you can take the 5 seconds to get out of your shoes and step into somebody else's and really hear the perspective that they're bringing to the conversation. And that even when you step back into your own, you can be aware and understanding of what was shared, and reminding too that empathy does not always equal agreement, and that there can be empathy without it always being, yep, I 100% agree with you. And so being able to really sit in that gray and in that nuanced space, I think is so important. And I truly wish everybody could get at least like a 1-hour class on empathy, because I feel like it would make the world even 1% better after everybody did a 60-minute class.
There you go. Yeah, I love that. What is one tip that you can share to help our listeners be more inclusive today? So not something where they have to take a class or spend money or something but just something practical they can just start doing today to be more inclusive.
I think a really great practical inclusion is just thinking, when you're thinking about doing anything with, friends, family, work colleagues, you're setting anything up, to take a beat and to say, is this going to be the best thing for the full group? Or is this just what I want? And taking that 5 seconds can sometimes be the tweak that you need in order to make a space slightly more inclusive. Like, like I think about, my friends, and the fact that we love a good birthday party moment, right? We love it. And because we're also trying to be inclusive of each other, one person isn't going to pick skydiving and be like, hey, y'all, you all have to come skydiving because I want to go skydiving, right? Because the rest of us don't want to do that. But, but they can say, you know what? I think it'd be really great to book a little karaoke room where everybody can come. And so the folks that are like not big on the outside social still get the social without the other things. And like, it's creating accommodation. That's really a way to be more inclusive, is figuring out the ways in which you can create accommodation for the people in your life. And that can be as small as like, you always have an extra pair of socks at your house for somebody who comes over. And that can be as big as you're double checking everybody's dietary restrictions before a meal. It really, inclusion comes in so many different ways, but mostly it starts with you stopping and thinking about what is the best for the full group, rather than always thinking, what is it that I want as the individual?
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, my daughter uses a wheelchair, so yeah, it's just, when somebody's having a birthday party, can we have it at a place where she's able to get into the location? Because if you're having it someplace that she can't get into it with her wheelchair, I mean, that's just telling me and her that you don't really want us there if she's not able to get into the space. So that's
exactly
a huge start thinking outwardly about what other people that are going to be there, like what needs do they have, what do they need. So that's awesome.
Yeah, it really, and again, it can be very small, but inclusion is those small moments a lot of the times. So it makes a big difference.
Yeah. Is there anything you want to share that we haven't discussed?
Not anything super in particular, just that I hope that folks enjoyed some of the things that we spoke about, and that I hope that it gives them the gumption to maybe go and do a little bit more research about intersectionality and learn about how it really corresponds with inclusion overall.
Sure. Do you have any like books or any resources about intersectionality that have been helpful that you could share with the audience?
Ooh, I'm gonna go ahead and say I'm gonna send you some links for the show notes.
Okay, sure.
Yeah. Because some things I think are not always just like a straight, here's a book you can go get from the library. Sure. But I have some folks that, I think speak about intersectionality very well in the pieces that they've done, whether it's been written, oral, et cetera, and like the presentation of it. Awesome. But I'll give some links for the show notes.
Awesome. Okay, you ready for the final question?
Yeah, let's do it.
Do you like spam, yes or no?
No.
No?
Okay. No.
I live in Austin, Minnesota, where they make spam, so I thought it'd be fun just to ask all my guests if they like spam or not. And I think I checked, we're There's actually more no's than yeses, which kind of doesn't surprise me, I guess.
Yeah, I feel like, like spam is one of those things that like I grew up around it. I just didn't want it.
For sure.
So I am very aware of all of the different things that can happen with spam to make them all, delicious in its own way. It's
Sure.
just not for me.
No, no problem. And then what's the best place for everybody to connect with you?
Yeah, so I am all over the internet. So any form of social media, for the most part, you can find me at I am Ashantis, Instagram, TikTok, Threads, Pinterest, all of the things. You can also visit me at my own website, ashantisjones.com, which is where I obviously spend a lot of my time just keeping people up to date with what I've got going on, whether it be a Grow Fitness class or it be a program, that's a group offering. I just launched a nutrition program with a registered dietitian that we're
Sure.
hosting through Patreon called Body Kind Nutrition, that was created essentially to help folks figure out how to eat food and what to cook when you're like, what am I going to cook for dinner at 3 p.m. every day? So yeah, between finding me there or finding me on my website, you'll be able to see all the things I've got going on in the world.
Perfect. And yeah, I think you sent me links for a lot of stuff too already, so I'll make sure I put those in the show notes as well so everybody can connect with you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for being on the show today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah. To all of you listening, thank you for joining us on this episode of the Inclusive Dad Podcast. If you enjoyed today's conversation, please subscribe, rate, or review the show. Your feedback helps us connect with more champions of inclusion. Remember to share this podcast with friends and family who might benefit. If you want to support us in our mission, please click on the link in the show description. Together, we can make the world more inclusive. Until next time, stay empowered and be a champion for inclusion.